The Arizona sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky, casting sharp shadows across the weathered wooden buildings of Copper Ridge. Dust devils danced between the saloon and the general store, stirring up the red earth that seemed to coat everything in this forgotten corner of the territory. It was the kind of heat that made men's tempers short and women's prayers longer. Sarah McKenna stumbled through the back door of the boarding house, her calico dress torn at the shoulder, dark hair falling loose from its pins. Her green eyes, usually bright with determination, now held the wild look of a cornered animal. Behind her, she could hear voices growing louder, boots hitting the wooden planks of the main street with purpose. "She can't have gone far." The voice of Sheriff Hawkins cut through the afternoon air like a rusty blade. "Check every building, every alley. Mrs. Delacroix wants her found before sundown." Sarah pressed her back against the rough wood siding, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give her away. The boarding house where she'd worked for 3 months stood empty now. Mrs. Patterson had gone to visit her sister in Tucson, leaving Sarah to tend the place alone. It should have been a blessing, a chance for peace. Instead, it had become her trap. She closed her eyes, remembering the events that had shattered her carefully built new life just hours before. Madame Delacroix's arrival in town had been like a storm cloud on the horizon. You could see it coming, but there was nowhere to run. The woman who owned half the gambling establishments between Santa Fe and Phoenix had eyes like a hawk and a memory longer than a locomotive. One look at Sarah serving coffee in the boarding house dining room, and 20 years of running had come to an end. "Sarah Beaumont," Madame Delacroix had whispered, her French accent making the name sound like a curse. "Or should I say, the daughter of the man who stole my fortune and left me for dead in New Orleans." The accusation had hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father's sins, buried deep in her childhood memories, had finally caught up with her. She'd been only 8 when they'd fled Louisiana, her father's gambling debts and shadowy business dealings forcing them to disappear into the vast anonymity of the frontier. But even 20 years wasn't long enough to escape some kinds of guilt. The sound of boots on gravel grew closer. Sarah knew she had perhaps minutes before they searched behind the buildings. Her mind raced through her options, each one leading to the same dead end. Madame Delacroix wasn't just angry, she was methodical. The kind of woman who would see Sarah hanged for her father's crimes, or worse, drag her back to Louisiana to face whatever twisted justice awaited there. Sarah looked toward the horizon, where the desert stretched endless and unforgiving. She'd tried to run once before, when she was 16 and had nearly died of thirst before a Mexican family found her. But staying meant certain death, or a fate worse than death. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She gathered what little courage remained and stepped away from the building's shadow. The main street lay before her, a gauntlet of watching eyes and whispered rumors. But if she could reach the livery stable at the far end of town, maybe she could convince old Pete to let her borrow a horse. Maybe she could disappear into the desert and pray that luck would favor her more than it had her father. The first step into the sunlight felt like stepping into her own execution. Every face that turned her way seemed to know her secret. Every whisper carried her name. She walked as quickly as she dared, her worn boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. The weight of eyes upon her made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to keep moving. "There!" a voice shouted from behind her. "There she is!" Sarah's composure cracked. She broke into a run, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The livery stable seemed miles away now, an impossible destination. Behind her, she could hear the thunder of pursuit, voices calling out, boots hitting hard-packed earth. She stumbled, catching herself against a hitching post, her vision blurring with tears of desperation. This was how it would end, not with the dignified new life she'd tried to build, but with the same shame and fear that had defined her childhood. She was her father's daughter, after all, doomed to run forever from sins she'd never committed but could never escape. The sound of a horse's hooves, steady and calm, cut through the chaos behind her. Sarah looked up to see a rider approaching from the opposite direction, a man she'd noticed around town but never spoken to. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, his weathered hat casting shadows across features that seemed carved from the same tough landscape that surrounded them. He was perhaps 30, with the lean build of a man who worked hard for his living. His clothes were simple but well-maintained. A blue cotton shirt, brown leather vest, and boots that had seen honest wear. Everything about him spoke of a man who belonged to this harsh country, who'd found his place in the unforgiving expanse of the American frontier. As their eyes met, Sarah saw something that stopped her in her tracks. Not judgment, not suspicion, but a kind of quiet understanding that seemed to cut straight through her panic to the desperate truth beneath. In that moment, standing in the dust of a nowhere town with her pursuers closing in, Sarah realized she was about to discover whether there were still men in this hard country who believed in something more than just survival. The rider's hand moved to his hat brim in a subtle gesture of acknowledgement, and Sarah felt the strange sensation that her fate was about to change directions as surely as a river changing course. Behind her, the voices grew louder, but ahead of her, this stranger sat motionless on his horse, watching her with eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. The collision of her past and present was about to create something entirely new, if she was brave enough to reach for it. The stranger's eyes held Sarah's for what felt like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a heartbeat. In that brief moment, she saw something that made her chest tighten with unexpected hope. Not pity, but recognition. As if he knew what it meant to run, to carry the weight of a past that wouldn't let go. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying the slight drawl of a man who'd grown up under these wide skies. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. The horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, stood perfectly still as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Behind Sarah, the shouts were getting closer. She could hear Sheriff Hawkins barking orders, the jingle of spurs, the creak of leather as armed men moved with purpose. Her legs felt like water, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at her to keep running, but there was nowhere left to go. The desert stretched out beyond the town like a promise of death, and behind her waited the certainty of it. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her throat like a prayer. "I haven't done anything wrong. My father, he made mistakes, but I was just a child. I've spent my whole life trying to make things right, trying to be better than the blood that runs in my veins." The man stepped closer, and she could see the details that made him real, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work, the way his brown eyes seemed to weigh her words, not for their truth, but for the pain behind them. "Jacob," he said quietly, extending the reins toward her. "Jacob Mitchell." Sarah stared at the leather straps in his outstretched hand, not understanding. "Your name," he said with gentle firmness. "From this moment on, to anyone who asks, you're Jacob Mitchell's wife. The horse is yours. The name is yours. Use them both to get as far from here as you can." The simple magnitude of what he was offering hit her like a physical blow. In a territory where a man's name was his most precious possession, where reputation could mean the difference between life and death, he was giving her his identity. A stranger was offering to erase himself to save her. "I can't," she breathed, even as her hands trembled with the desire to reach for the reins. "You don't understand. They'll come after you. When they can't find me, they'll—" "Let me worry about that," Jacob said. His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who'd faced hard choices before and lived with the consequences. "Sometimes a person gets one chance to do something that matters. I figure this might be mine." The sound of running feet grew louder. Sarah could hear individual voices now. Men she'd served coffee to, men who'd tipped their hats politely when she'd passed them on the street. Now they hunted her like an animal, driven by the promise of Madame Delacroix's gold and the simple human hunger for excitement in a place where excitement usually meant death. "Take the horse," Jacob said again, his tone brooking no argument. "Head northwest toward the old mining camps. There's water at Devil's Spring, about 15 miles out. After that, you'll need to decide whether you're running towards something or just away from it." Sarah's hands closed around the reins before her mind had fully processed the decision. The leather felt warm from Jacob's touch, solid and real in a world that had turned to quicksand beneath her feet. The horse nickered softly, as if recognizing that it was about to embark on something significant. "Why?" she asked, the question barely audible above the growing tumult behind them. "You don't know me. You don't know what I might have done." Jacob's smile was small but genuine, creasing the corners of his eyes in a way that spoke of a man who'd found reasons to smile even in hard country. "I know you're scared. I know you're running from something that ain't your fault. And I know that sometimes the measure of a person isn't what they've done, but what they're willing to do when everything falls apart." He stepped back, giving her space to mount, but his eyes never left hers. "Besides," he added with a hint of something that might have been humor, "I've been Jacob Mitchell for 28 years, and I can't say it's been anything special. Maybe it'll suit you better." Sarah swung herself up into the saddle, her body moving with the muscle memory of childhood rides on her father's horses, back when life had been simpler and the future had seemed full of promise instead of threat. The horse responded to her touch immediately, sensing a competent rider despite her obvious distress. From horseback, she could see over the buildings to where her pursuers were spreading out, searching systematically. Sheriff Hawkins stood in the middle of the street, his hand shading his eyes as he scanned the horizon. In moments, they would round the corner and find her, find them. "Jacob," she said, testing the name on her tongue. It felt strange but not wrong, like putting on clothes that didn't quite fit but would serve their purpose. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," he replied, stepping away from the horse. "That I saw a frightened woman riding hard toward the desert. That I tried to stop her but she wouldn't listen. That by the time I could have done anything, she was already too far gone to catch." It wasn't quite a lie, Sarah realized. In a few minutes it would be exactly the truth. The distinction seemed important somehow, that even in this desperate moment, Jacob Mitchell was choosing his words with the precision of a man who valued honesty above convenience. "There!" a voice shouted from around the corner. "Mitchell, you seen a woman come this way?" Jacob's eyes met Sarah's one last time. In them, she saw an entire conversation compressed into a single look, encouragement, warning, and something that might have been blessing all rolled into one. Then he turned toward the approaching men, his shoulders squaring as he prepared to face whatever consequences his kindness might bring. Sarah pressed her heels to the horse's flanks, feeling the powerful muscles bunch beneath her as the animal leaped forward. Behind her, she heard Jacob's voice, calm and steady, beginning to weave the story that would give her the precious gift of time. Ahead lay the desert, vast and unforgiving, but also anonymous. A place where Sarah McKenna could disappear forever, and where someone new, someone carrying the name Jacob Mitchell like a talisman against the past, might find a way to survive. As the horse carried her toward the horizon, Sarah found herself crying, not from fear now, but from something far more complex. A stranger had just given her everything he had to give, asking nothing in return except that she use his gift wisely. It was the kind of gesture that novels were written about, but Sarah had learned long ago that real life rarely offered such clean heroism. Yet here it was, in the form of a man who'd chosen to see her desperation and answer it with his own brand of frontier justice. As Copper Ridge fell away behind her, Sarah promised herself that whatever happened next, she would find a way to be worthy of Jacob Mitchell's name. Even if she never saw him again, she would carry his gift forward and try to become the kind of person who deserved such trust from a stranger. The desert opened before her like a blank page, ready to be written with whatever story she had the courage to tell. Jacob watched the dust cloud kicked up by his horse disappear into the heat shimmer of the desert horizon. The woman, Sarah, she'd called herself, rode like she'd been born to it, her body moving with the horse's rhythm despite her obvious terror. That was something, at least. In this country, knowing how to ride could mean the difference between life and death, and she'd need every advantage the harsh landscape could offer. "Mitchell!" Sheriff Hawkins's voice cut through the afternoon heat like the crack of a whip. Jacob turned slowly, his hands hanging loose at his sides, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. 3 deputies flanked Hawkins, their hands resting on their gun belts with the casual readiness of men who'd learned to expect trouble in a place where trouble was the most reliable crop. "Sheriff," Jacob nodded, touching the brim of his hat with respectful courtesy. "Something I can help you with?" Hawkins was a lean man with pale eyes and a mustache that never seemed to grow beyond scraggly, despite his obvious efforts to maintain it. He'd been sheriff for 2 years, ever since the previous man had been found face down in Willow Creek with a bullet in his back. The job paid well because few men wanted it, and those who took it rarely kept it long. "Looking for a woman," Hawkins said, his eyes scanning the empty street behind Jacob as if Sarah might materialize from the dust and heat. Sarah McKenna, though she might be going by other names. Young, dark hair, green eyes, was staying at the Patterson boarding house. Jacob's expression remained neutral, though inside he felt a cold appreciation for the weight of what he'd just done. If they knew her name, knew where she'd been staying, then this wasn't a casual pursuit. This was organized, purposeful, and backed by the kind of money that made sheriffs cooperative and deputies eager. "Can't say I've spoken to her," Jacob said truthfully. "Mrs. Patterson's been gone to Tucson this past week, hasn't she? Place has been quiet." She was seen heading this direction," Deputy Carson added. He was younger than Hawkins, with the quick nervousness of a man trying to prove himself worthy of the badge. "Running scared," witnesses said. "Like she'd done something terrible." Jacob shrugged, the gesture carrying just the right amount of disinterest. "Lot of folks run scared in this country. Desert's full of bones of people who thought they could outrun their troubles on foot. You see anyone heading out toward the desert?" Hawkins pressed, his pale eyes studying Jacob's face for any telltale signs of deception. "Anyone at all?" "Matter of fact, I did," Jacob said, and watched as the deputies straightened with renewed interest. "Woman on horseback, riding hard toward the Badlands. Tried to call out to her, see if she needed help, but she was spooked something fierce. Wouldn't even slow down." It wasn't a lie, Jacob reminded himself. In about 10 minutes, it would be the absolute truth. The distinction mattered to him, though he doubted it would matter to anyone else if they discovered what he'd done. "What did she look like?" Carson demanded, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon. "Could you see her face?" Jacob frowned, as if trying to recall details of a brief and unimportant encounter. "Hard to say. Had a hat pulled low, riding clothes. Could have been anyone, really, but she was pushing that horse like the devil himself was after her." "Which direction?" Hawkins asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Jacob pointed northwest, toward the endless expanse of red rock and scrub brush that stretched away from Copper Ridge like a promise of emptiness. "That way. Toward the old mining district, looked like. Though if she kept that pace, the horse won't last long in this heat." The deputies exchanged glances. Everyone in the territory knew the stories of people who'd ventured into the desert unprepared. The lucky ones were found days later, sun-mad and barely alive. The unlucky ones became part of the landscape, their bones picked clean by scavengers and scattered by the wind. "We'll need to organize a search party," Hawkins said, but his tone lacked enthusiasm. A desert chase in late afternoon heat was dangerous for everyone involved, and the chances of finding anyone who didn't want to be found were slim at best. "Carson, round up some volunteers. Tell them there's money in it. Madame Delacroix is offering a substantial reward." At the mention of the name, Jacob felt his stomach tighten slightly. Madame Delacroix was legendary throughout the territory, a woman who'd built an empire of gambling halls and saloons through a combination of shrewd business sense and absolute ruthlessness. If she wanted Sarah McKenna found, then the woman Jacob had just helped escape was in more danger than he'd realized. "You'll be wanting to get started soon," Jacob observed mildly. "Daylight's burning, and that country gets treacherous after dark." "What about you, Mitchell?" Hawkins asked suddenly. "You know the desert better than most. There's good money for a man willing to guide a search party." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Jacob. They were asking him to help hunt down the woman he'd just saved, to use his knowledge of the country to undo his own act of mercy. For a moment, he considered it. Not the betrayal, but the opportunity to misdirect the search, to lead them away from Sarah's actual path. But that would mean spending days in the saddle with men whose only goal was to drag a frightened woman back to face whatever justice Madame Delacroix had planned. It would mean looking them in the eye every morning, knowing that every mile they rode away from their quarry was a mile he'd deliberately stolen from them. "Appreciate the offer," Jacob said finally, "but I've got responsibilities here in town. Mrs. Garrett's expecting me to finish some work on her fence before the week's out." It was a weak excuse, but it would have to do. Hawkins nodded absently, his attention already shifting to the logistics of organizing a pursuit in hostile country. The sheriff was a practical man who understood that desert chases were expensive in both money and lives, and that Madame Delacroix's gold would have to be substantial enough to make the risk worthwhile. "If you see anything," Hawkins said as he turned to go, "anyone coming back from that direction, you send word immediately. This woman is dangerous, wanted for theft and worse back in Louisiana. Anyone helping her would be making a serious mistake." Jacob nodded solemnly, filing away this new information about Sarah's supposed crimes. Theft was one thing. Half the people in the territory had bent the law at some point, usually out of desperation rather than greed. But worse could mean anything, and Hawkins had said it with the kind of emphasis that suggested violence. Still, as he watched the sheriff and his deputies walk away, Jacob found that it didn't change his decision. He'd looked into Sarah McKenna's eyes and seen fear, not cruelty. He'd heard the tremor in her voice when she'd spoken of her father's sins, and it had carried the ring of truth. Whatever she'd done or been accused of doing, she was running from it, rather than toward more of the same. In Jacob's experience, that distinction mattered. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob went about his business with deliberate normalcy. He stopped by the hardware store to pick up nails for Mrs. Garrett's fence, exchanged pleasantries with the clerk about the weather and the price of cattle, and made a point of being seen by several townspeople who might later vouch for his whereabouts. All the while, part of his mind tracked the position of the sun, calculating how far Sarah might have traveled, whether she'd found water, whether his directions to Devil's Spring had been clear enough. The desert was unforgiving to those who didn't understand its rhythms, but it was also vast enough to swallow a single rider completely if she was smart about her route. By evening, when the search party finally rode out of town in a cloud of dust and self-importance, Jacob estimated that Sarah had at least a 4-hour head start and the advantage of traveling light. The posse, weighed down by supplies and the collective inexperience of men more comfortable in saloons than saddles, would be lucky to make half her time across the broken country northwest of town. As he watched their dust trail fade into the gathering dusk, Jacob allowed himself a small smile. He'd given Sarah McKenna his name and his horse, but more importantly, he'd given her time. In this country, time was often the most valuable commodity of all. The difference between escape and capture, between a new beginning and a violent end. Now all he could do was wait, and hope that his gift would be enough, and that somewhere out in the vast anonymity of the desert, a frightened woman was finding the strength to become someone new, someone worthy of the name Jacob Mitchell, even if the original owner never saw her again. The stars were coming out as Jacob finally headed home, their cold light already beginning to touch the mountains on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and possibly new consequences for his choice. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jacob Mitchell felt like he'd done something that mattered, even if no one else ever knew it. 3 months later, the woman who had once been Sarah McKenna stood on the porch of a small ranch house, watching the sunset paint the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and crimson. The mountains in the distance looked like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with snow that caught the dying light like scattered diamonds. It was a beautiful, harsh country, the kind of place where a person could disappear completely if they had the courage to let their old self die. She'd kept the name Jacob had given her, though she'd modified it slightly for practicality. To the scattered ranchers and traders in this isolated valley, she was Jake Mitchell, a young widow who'd inherited her late husband's modest spread and was determined to make it work despite the odds. The story came easily now, worn smooth by repetition and necessity. The truth was more complicated. After fleeing Copper Ridge, she'd ridden Jacob's horse hard for 2 days, following his directions to Devil's Spring, and then beyond, into country so remote that even the Apache rarely bothered with it. When the horse had finally begun to flag, she'd traded it to a Mexican family for food, shelter, and directions to the nearest town where a person could start fresh, without too many questions asked. That town had been Silver Creek, a dying mining settlement where the silver had played out, but the people remained, too stubborn or too poor to leave. The land office had records of a small ranch that had been abandoned when its owner died of fever the previous winter. For the price of the back taxes, Jake Mitchell had acquired 160 acres of marginal grazing land, a 2-room house that needed work, and the chance to become someone new. The work had been brutal at first. Jake's hands, soft from years of serving coffee and making beds, had cracked and bled as she learned to repair fences, tend livestock, and coax crops from soil that seemed more dust than earth. But the physical pain had been a welcome distraction from the constant fear that had followed her from Arizona. The certainty that Madame Delacroix's reach was long and her memory longer. Now 3 months later, Jake had calluses instead of blisters, and the small herd of cattle she'd bought with the last of her savings was actually beginning to thrive. More importantly, she'd found something she'd never expected, a sense of belonging. The neighboring ranchers had accepted her story without too much scrutiny, perhaps understanding that in this country, everyone had secrets worth keeping. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her evening reverie. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Old habits died hard, and she'd learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. But as the rider crested the small rise that led to her property, Jake felt her heart skip in recognition. Even silhouetted against the fading sky, there was no mistaking the easy way he sat his horse, the familiar tilt of his hat, the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. Jacob Mitchell, the real Jacob Mitchell, was riding toward her home as if he'd always known exactly where to find her. Jake stood slowly, her mind racing through possibilities. Had he come to reclaim his name, to demand his horse back? Had he somehow discovered that she'd used his identity to build this new life? Or worse, had Madame Delacroix's men found him and forced him to reveal what he'd done? Jacob dismounted at the edge of the yard, his movements as fluid and economical as she remembered. He was travel-dusty and obviously tired, but his eyes held the same quiet strength that had given her hope in her darkest moment. When he smiled, Jake felt something in her chest ease slightly. Whatever had brought him here, it wasn't anger. "Mom," he said, touching his hat brim in the same courteous gesture he'd offered in Copper Ridge. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was in the area and heard tell of a rancher named Mitchell. Thought I might pay a visit." Jake's throat felt dry as desert sand. "Mr. Mitchell," she managed, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is." Jacob agreed, his tone carrying a hint of something that might have been amusement. "Mind if I water my horse? It's been a long ride from Silver Creek." The mention of the town confirmed what Jake had already suspected. Jacob hadn't found her by accident. He'd tracked her here deliberately, following whatever trail of papers and records she'd left in establishing her new identity. The realization should have terrified her, but instead she felt oddly relieved. The waiting was over. "Of course," Jake said, gesturing toward the small corral, where her own horses stood watching the newcomer with mild interest. "There's grain in the barn if he needs it." As Jacob tended to his mount, Jake studied him covertly, looking for signs of the consequences she'd feared he might face. But he seemed healthy and unharmed, his clothes well maintained, his equipment in good repair. Whatever had happened in Copper Ridge after her escape, it hadn't destroyed him. "Nice spread you've got here," Jacob observed as he returned from the corral. "Hard country, but honest. The kind of place where a person can make something of themselves if they're willing to work for it." "It suits me," Jake replied carefully. She wanted to ask him a dozen questions. Why he'd come, how he'd found her, what had happened after she'd fled. But the words seemed to stick in her throat like burrs. Jacob nodded toward the house. "Mind if we sit a spell? I've got some news that might interest you, Mrs. Mitchell." The formal use of the name he'd given her sent a strange shiver through Jake. She led him to the porch, where two simple wooden chairs faced the valley and the distant mountains. Jacob settled into one with a grateful sigh, his eyes scanning the neat garden, the well-maintained fences, the small signs of prosperity that Jake had worked so hard to achieve. "You've done well with the name," he said finally. "Better than I ever did, truth be told." "Jacob," Jake began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. "I never meant to steal your identity. I just needed—" "A chance," Jacob finished for her. "I know. And from the look of things, you made good use of it." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I came to tell you that you don't have to worry about Copper Ridge anymore. Madame Delacroix got word about a month ago that Sarah McKenna died in the desert. Apparently, some prospectors found bones and personal effects near Devil's Spring. Case closed as far as she's concerned." Jake felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush. "But I never—" "I know," Jacob said quietly. "Funny thing about bones in the desert. Hard to tell one set from another after the coyotes have been at them. Especially when there are people around who understand the value of letting sleeping dogs lie." The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. Jacob hadn't just saved her once. He'd continued to protect her, somehow arranging for evidence that would convince Madame Delacroix that her enemy was dead. The magnitude of his continued sacrifice left her speechless. "Why?" she whispered, the question that had haunted her for 3 months finally finding voice. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Jake began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully hidden beneath years of acceptance. "Had a sister once," he said simply, "about your age when she got mixed up with the wrong kind of people, made some bad choices, trusted the wrong man. When trouble came looking for her, there wasn't anyone around to offer her a horse and a new name." He turned to look at Jake directly, his brown eyes steady and serious. "She died running through country not much different from this, alone and scared and carrying sins that weren't really hers to carry." Understanding flooded through Jake like cold water. Jacob's generosity hadn't been random. It had been personal, a chance to save someone else's sister when he hadn't been able to save his own. The knowledge made his gift even more precious, and her responsibility to honor it even greater. "I'm sorry," Jake said inadequately. "Don't be," Jacob replied. "Just be worth it. Make something good out of what you've been given. That's all anyone can do." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Jake found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. The fear, the desperate flight, the gradual transformation from Sarah McKenna, the frightened daughter of a dead gambler, to Jake Mitchell, the determined rancher who'd carved a life out of unforgiving country. "There's something else," Jacob said eventually. "Real reason I came all this way." Jake tensed, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Had he changed his mind about his gift? Come to reclaim what was rightfully his? "I was wondering," Jacob continued, and there was something almost shy in his voice now, "if you might have use for a partner. Someone who knows cattle and horses, can help with the heavy work. I'm tired of drifting, and this seems like the kind of place a man could put down roots." The proposal hit Jake like a thunderbolt. After everything Jacob had done for her, he was asking if he could share in the life she'd built with his name. The symmetry of it, the rightness of it, brought tears to her eyes. "I don't have much to offer," Jake said honestly. "The ranch is small, the profit margin's thin. It would mean starting over, working twice as hard as most folks for half the reward." "Sounds perfect," Jacob said with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "Besides, seems to me we've both had enough of running. Time to see what we can build, if we stand still long enough." Jake looked out over the land she'd come to love, the hard country that had tested her and found her worthy, the mountains that stood like sentinels against the sky, the valley that had become her sanctuary. It was a good place for a fresh start, for two people who'd learned the value of second chances. "Partners," she said, extending her hand toward the man who'd given her everything he had to give, and was now asking for the chance to share in what she'd made of it. Jacob's handshake was firm and warm, sealing a bargain that went far deeper than business arrangements. As they sat on the porch of what was now their home, Jake realized that sometimes the greatest gifts came not from having everything you wanted, but from finding someone who understood that the best things in life were worth building slowly, carefully, and together. The woman who had once been Sarah McKenna was gone forever, buried somewhere in the desert between Copper Ridge and Silver Creek. In her place sat Jake Mitchell, rancher and partner, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, with the quiet strength that came from knowing she was no longer running alone. The name Jacob Mitchell had saved her life, but more than that, it had given her the chance to become the person she'd always had the potential to be. And now, with the original Jacob Mitchell beside her, she finally understood that some gifts were meant to be shared, growing stronger with each act of trust and generosity they inspired. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, its voice carrying across the valley like a benediction. Jake smiled and settled back in her chair, finally truly home.